The greatest irony of my life is that I lost everything the moment I finally told the truth. For 3 decades, I had been a professional liar, not through malice, but through omission, through careful silence, through the exhausting performance of being a man I wasn't. I taught wisdom while hiding the wisdom that was transforming me. I discussed truth while concealing the truth I'd discovered. I stood before students in a philosophy classroom at one of Saudi Arabia's most prestigious Islamic universities and spoke about Plato and Aristotle and Avicenna, while the teacher whose words had haunted me for 30 years remained unmentioned, unacknowledged, forbidden. Until September 14, 2024, when something inside me broke. I picked up a blue marker in classroom 3C of the philosophy department at Imam Muhammad ibn Saud Islamic University in Riyadh. I turned to the whiteboard, and I wrote 4 sentences in Arabic that I'd been carrying in secret since my graduate years in Cairo. 72 hours later, my career was over. 3 weeks after that, I was dying in a hospital parking lot with 42 stab wounds. But in losing my life, I finally found it. My name is Dr. Hamza al-Rashidi. I am 52 years old, and this is how I, a Saudi philosophy professor, finally stopped running from the truth I'd been studying for 30 years. The classroom that afternoon was unremarkable. September heat pressed against the windows of the 3rd-floor philosophy building, the air conditioning humming its constant white noise. 18 graduate students sat in curved rows of desks, some attentive, some distracted, all of them children of privilege who had never questioned the foundations upon which their comfortable lives rested. I had taught this same comparative ethics seminar for 12 years. The syllabus was approved, the readings were vetted, the boundaries were clear. We would examine Greek philosophy, Islamic moral theology, Eastern traditions, and we would mention, always carefully, always with scholarly distance, the ethical systems of other Abrahamic faiths. Judaism could be discussed as historical context. Christianity could be referenced as philosophical influence on Western thought. But always with the protective barrier of academic language, always as artifacts to be studied, never as truths to be considered. I had mastered this performance. I could discuss the Sermon on the Mount without revealing that I had read it hundreds of times. I could analyze the Beatitudes without confessing that they had been working on my heart like water on stone, slowly, relentlessly reshaping everything I thought I knew about God and goodness and grace. But on that Tuesday afternoon in September, 30 years of careful performance collapsed. I was lecturing on ancient ethical inversions, how different civilizations had challenged conventional values, how moral teachers had often proclaimed the opposite of what their cultures considered wise. I mentioned Socrates choosing death over compromise. I referenced Buddhist teachings on non-attachment. I discussed Sufi poets who spoke of spiritual poverty as wealth. And then I reached for the marker. The movement was almost unconscious, my hand acting before my mind could intervene with its usual caution. I turned to the whiteboard and began writing in clear Arabic script, my handwriting that had filled 1,000 classroom boards over 26 years. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. The silence in the room was absolute. I could feel it pressing against my back as I wrote, a physical presence, heavy with significance I couldn't yet name. The usual rustling of papers had stopped. The soft clicking of laptop keys had ceased. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet, as if the room itself was holding its breath. When I turned back to face my students, I saw it immediately in their faces. Not confusion, they knew these words, recognized their source even if they had never read them in full context. What I saw was shock, and something that might have been fear. In the 3rd row, Fahad al-Mutairi sat with his phone beneath his desk, its screen glowing faintly. I would learn later that he had been recording for the past 15 minutes. I would learn that the red light had been visible to everyone except me. I would learn that while I had been writing those 4 sentences, he had been capturing evidence that would destroy everything I had built. But in that moment, I knew none of this. I only knew that I had crossed a line I could never uncross, spoken words I could never unspeak, revealed a truth I could never hide again. And instead of the panic I should have felt, I felt relief so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. If you've ever hidden who you really are to protect what you've built, if you've ever felt the weight of performing a life that doesn't match your soul, then what happened next will shake you. Subscribe to this channel, because this testimony will show you what happens when the mask finally falls, when the cost of truth becomes unbearable, and when losing everything becomes the path to finding what you never knew you were missing. I was born in 1972 in the Al Nasim district of Riyadh, a neighborhood of government employees and educators where ambition was measured in degrees earned and positions secured. My father, Abdulaziz Al-Rashidi, worked in the Ministry of Higher Education as a curriculum specialist. My mother, Noor, had been one of the first generation of Saudi women to attend university. She studied Arabic literature at King Saud University before marriage, and motherhood redirected her path. Unlike many households in our neighborhood, ours was filled with books. My father believed that education was not merely preparation for employment, but the cultivation of the mind itself. He brought home texts on history, science, classical Arabic poetry, translations of foreign works that had been approved by the censors. My mother taught me to read before I entered primary school. She would sit with me in the late afternoons after the heat broke, her finger tracing the Arabic letters in children's books, then in more complex texts, then in volumes of poetry that most children my age would never encounter. She taught me something else too, though she never said it explicitly. She taught me that women's minds were as sharp as men's, that education truncated by social expectation was a tragedy, that her sacrifice had been necessary but not noble. She planted in me a hunger for learning that would define my entire life and eventually lead me to questions that had no safe answers. I excelled in school from my earliest years, top of my class in primary school, highest marks in secondary school. The kind of student teachers remembered, whose name they mentioned when discussing promising youth, whose future seemed predetermined by the trajectory of his success. But I was also the student who asked too many questions, who wanted to know not just what was true, but why it was true, who challenged assumptions that other students accepted without examination, who made teachers uncomfortable with inquiries that ventured beyond the approved curriculum. My religious education teacher in secondary school, a stern man named Sheikh Hassan, who had memorized the entire Quran by age 12, once told my father that I had a dangerous mind. He said it as a warning, but my father heard it as a compliment. He told me that night that dangerous minds were the only minds worth having, that safety was the enemy of truth, that I should never stop asking questions even when the questions made people uncomfortable. I didn't understand then that this encouragement would one day cost me everything, that the questions my father had praised would lead me to answers he never imagined I would find. I attended Imam Muhammad ibn Saud Islamic University in Riyadh beginning in 1990, initially studying Islamic jurisprudence because that was what serious young men from serious families were expected to study. I performed well, memorized the required texts, mastered the methodologies of interpretation, absorbed the frameworks within which religious knowledge was organized. But something was missing. The certainty my professors proclaimed felt hollow the more closely I examined it. The answers they provided only generated more questions. The system that was supposed to satisfy my hunger for truth only made me hungrier. In my third year, I discovered philosophy almost by accident, an elective course taught by an elderly Egyptian professor named Dr. Mahmoud Tariq, who had studied in Germany before returning to the Arab world. He introduced me to Socrates and Plato, to the pre-Socratics and the Stoics, to questions that transcended any single religious tradition. What is the good life? How should we treat one another? What gives existence meaning? Is there anything beyond death? These were human questions, not merely Muslim questions or Christian questions or questions that belonged to any particular faith. They were questions that connected me to thinkers across every civilization and every age. And for the first time in my academic life, I felt like I was pursuing something real. I changed my major to philosophy in my fourth year, much to my father's concern. He worried, rightly as it turned out, that philosophy would lead me into dangerous intellectual territory, that the questions I loved so much would eventually undermine the certainties that had structured our family's life. But he didn't forbid it. He believed too deeply in the value of education to block my path, even when that path led somewhere he feared to follow. I completed my undergraduate degree with highest honors in 1994. I was 22 years old, intellectually alive in ways I had never been, and desperate to go deeper. When I was awarded a scholarship to pursue graduate studies in Cairo, my father embraced me at the airport and whispered, "Don't lose yourself in all those questions, Hamza. Remember who you are." I promised him I would remember, but I was already forgetting, and I didn't even know it yet. Cairo in 1994 was a different world from Riyadh, louder, older, more chaotic, more intellectually free. I enrolled in the philosophy doctoral program at Cairo University, living in a small apartment in the Docky neighborhood near the Nile, surrounded by bookstores and coffee houses where students argued about Hegel and Heidegger until dawn. My doctoral advisor was Dr. Samir Youssef, an Egyptian Muslim who had completed his PhD at the University of Tübingen in Germany. He was unlike any scholar I had encountered in Saudi Arabia. He assigned readings from Christian theologians alongside Muslim philosophers, from Jewish mystics alongside Greek rationalists, from atheist existentialists alongside medieval saints. His philosophy was simple and dangerous. Truth is too important to approach with sectarian blinders. A philosopher who refuses to read widely is like a physician who refuses to study anatomy. You cannot understand the human condition by examining only the texts your own tradition approves. The university library in Cairo contained books that would have been confiscated at the Saudi border, works by Western philosophers who questioned God's existence, comparative religion texts that treated all faiths as equally valid human constructs, and copies of the Torah and the Christian Gospels in Arabic translation, sitting on the shelves like any other historical documents, available to anyone who wanted to read them. I read the Gospel of Matthew for the first time in my second year of graduate studies. It was a Thursday evening in my apartment, Cairo traffic creating its constant symphony outside my window, a glass of mint tea growing cold beside me as I turned the pages of a borrowed copy. I had approached the text as a scholar, pen in hand, notebook open, prepared to analyze literary structure and historical context and philosophical implications. But something happened that I did not expect. The words reached past my analytical defenses and touched something deeper. The Sermon on the Mount particularly struck me with a force I could not deflect through academic distance. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The Quran spoke with divine authority, commanding, prohibiting, establishing law. The Hadith collections preserved the Prophet's example for believers to follow, but Jesus spoke differently. He spoke of inner transformation, of attitudes and motivations, of a righteousness that exceeded mere compliance with rules. He spoke of loving enemies, praying for persecutors, turning the other cheek, going the extra mile, giving to those who ask, forgiving 70 times 7. The ethics were unlike anything I had encountered. The Roman world valued strength, power, conquest. The Jewish world of Jesus' time valued purity, separation, strict adherence to law. But Jesus blessed the weak, the mourning, the meek, the hungry. He inverted everything the ancient world considered valuable. He elevated the lowly and humbled the proud. He proclaimed that the last would be first and the first would be last, that the kingdom of heaven belonged to those who had nothing and wanted nothing except righteousness. I read through the night, consuming all 4 Gospels in a single sitting, the parables with their unexpected reversals, the confrontations with religious authorities who had reduced faith to performance, the healings and the miracles and the teachings that challenged every assumption about how God related to humanity. And then I read the crucifixion accounts, the innocent one dying for the guilty, the king mocked and crowned with thorns, the sacrifice that made reconciliation possible between holy God and sinful humanity. I had studied sacrifice in Islamic theology, the rituals of Eid, the substitutionary ram for Ishmael, the concept of atonement through animal blood. But this was different. This was God Himself entering into human suffering, bearing the weight of human sin, dying the death that humanity deserved. I closed the book as dawn broke over Cairo, the call to prayer echoing from a dozen nearby mosques, and I realized with a chill that ran down my spine. I had just read something that made more sense of the human condition than anything I had encountered in my Islamic studies. I didn't believe it yet, not religiously, not with the commitment of faith, but intellectually, philosophically, as someone trained to recognize profound truth when I encountered it. I knew I had just read something extraordinary, something dangerous, something I could study, but never ever follow. Not if I wanted to keep my family, my future, my place in the only world I had ever known. Have you ever encountered a truth that you knew would cost you everything if you embraced it? Have you ever stood at the edge of a revelation that would destroy your comfortable life if you stepped into it? Comment below if you've ever felt that terrifying pull towards something real, something dangerous, something that would change everything. And subscribe, because what I did with that dangerous truth would take 30 years to unfold. I spent the next 6 years in Cairo completing my doctorate, reading everything I could find on comparative ethics, constructing elaborate intellectual frameworks that would allow me to appreciate Jesus' teachings without surrendering to them. I became an expert in compartmentalization, the skill of holding contradictory ideas in separate mental chambers, never allowing them to touch, never forcing them into confrontation. My dissertation examined ethical inversions across civilizations, how moral teachers from Socrates to Buddha to the Hebrew prophets had challenged conventional values. I dedicated an entire chapter to what I carefully called the Nazarene ethical tradition, analyzing the Sermon on the Mount alongside other ancient wisdom texts. My advisor praised the work as brilliantly balanced. I had demonstrated deep knowledge of Christian teaching while maintaining scholarly objectivity. I had discussed Jesus without confessing anything about what his words were doing to my heart. It was a masterpiece of academic dishonesty, and it earned me my PhD with highest distinction. I returned to Saudi Arabia in 2000 at age 28, with my doctorate completed, my mind filled with dangerous knowledge, and my heart protected by layers of rationalization that I told myself were sophisticated philosophy, but were actually just elaborate cowardice. I secured a position at Imam Muhammad ibn Saud Islamic University as an assistant professor of philosophy. The irony was not lost on me. I was teaching at one of the kingdom's most conservative Islamic universities, while carrying secrets that would have disqualified me from consideration if anyone had known, but no one knew. I was careful. I taught philosophy within acceptable boundaries, using approved texts, maintaining proper scholarly distance from non-Islamic sources. When I discussed Christian or Jewish ideas, I attributed them carefully, framed them as historical curiosities, never suggested they might contain truth that rivaled or exceeded Islamic teaching. I married in 2002. Her name was Salma, the daughter of a colleague in the Islamic Studies department. She was quiet, devout, intelligent without being intellectually threatening. Our courtship was brief and proper, arranged by our families with our consent, consummated in a traditional ceremony in her father's home in the Al-Muruj district. We had 2 children, a son we named Omar, born in 2004, and a daughter we named Layla, born in 2007. I loved them with the fierce protective love that fathers feel, but I also feared for them. Feared what my questions might do to their faith if I ever spoke them aloud. Feared the price they would pay if my carefully constructed double life ever collapsed. The years passed quickly. I published books on Islamic philosophy and comparative ethics. I trained doctoral students. I received promotions, assistant professor to associate professor to full professor. I served on university committees. I was awarded grants and honors. By external measures, I was extraordinarily successful. Dr. Hamza al-Rashidi, respected scholar, devoted father, faithful Muslim, model citizen of the kingdom. But internally, the compartments were beginning to crack. The questions I had been containing were growing too large for their chambers. The truth I had been appreciating from a distance was demanding a response I wasn't ready to give. I began reading the Gospels again in private around 2021, 3 years before everything collapsed. Not for academic research this time, but for something I couldn't name. A hunger that Islamic devotion wasn't satisfying. A thirst that ritual prayers weren't quenching. I would wake before dawn, before the call to Fajr prayer, and sit in my home office with an Arabic New Testament I had purchased during a trip to Dubai, where such books could be found in certain bookstores that catered to the expatriate Christian community. I read slowly, meditatively, allowing the words to work on me rather than analyzing them from professional distance. And I began to realize something terrifying. I was no longer reading about Jesus. I was beginning to believe in him. Not as a prophet, which Islam permitted, but as something more. As Lord, as Savior, as the Son of God who had died for my sins and risen from the dead. The realization filled me with joy and absolute terror, because I knew what believing would cost. I had known for 30 years, and I wasn't ready to pay that price. Not yet, maybe never. So I kept reading in secret, and teaching in public, and living the double life that was slowly killing me from the inside out. September 14th, 2024, started like any other Saturday. I woke at 5 a.m. for Fajr prayer, performed my ablutions mechanically while my mind wandered to the lecture I would give that afternoon. I had taught comparative ethics hundreds of times. I knew the material cold. There was no reason that day should have been different from any other, but I woke with an unusual weight in my chest. Not physical pain, but a spiritual pressure I couldn't name. Something building, something about to break. The lecture was scheduled for 2 p.m. in classroom 3C on the 3rd floor of the philosophy building. 18 students enrolled, 15 present that day. Graduate students pursuing advanced degrees in Islamic philosophy, all of them bright, most of them conventional in their thinking. Fahad al-Mutairi sat in his usual spot in the 3rd row. I had known Fahad for years. He had been a student in my introductory course 5 years earlier, had followed me into the graduate program, had always watched me with eyes that seemed to be searching for something beneath the surface. What I didn't know until later was that Fahad was the son of my childhood friend Khalid al-Mutairi, who had died in a car accident in 2010. Khalid and I had grown up together in Al-Nasim, played football in dusty streets, studied together for university entrance exams. When he died, I had gone to the funeral, embraced his widow, promised to look after his children if they ever needed anything. Fahad had never mentioned the connection. He had taken my courses under his full name while I had known his father only as Khalid Abu Yasir, never making the family link. He had watched me for 5 years, his dead father's friend, searching perhaps for the man his father had told stories about. I began the lecture normally, providing historical context for ancient ethical systems, discussing the emergence of Christianity within the Roman Empire, explaining the Jewish background of Jesus' teaching. The students took notes, asked occasional questions, engaged with the material as they always did. Then I reached the Sermon on the Mount. I had lectured on it before, always carefully, always with protective phrases. Christians interpret this as, from the Christian perspective, the historical significance lies in. But that afternoon, those protective phrases felt like lies, felt like betrayals of truth I had been carrying for 30 years, felt like one more performance in a life built on performance. I turned to the whiteboard, picked up the blue marker, and my hand began moving before my mind could stop it. In clear Arabic script that filled the center of the board, I wrote, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." The silence was absolute. I could feel it pressing against my back as I wrote, heavy with significance. When I turned to face my students, I saw shock on their faces. Not confusion, They recognized these words, knew their source, understood what it meant that I had written them so prominently, so reverently. In the third row, Fahad sat with his phone beneath his desk, its screen glowing. The red recording light was visible to everyone except me. I should have stopped there, should have erased the words, made some joke about illustrating a point, returned to safe academic distance. Instead, I began to speak, not as Professor al-Rashidi delivering an approved lecture, but as Hamza, a man who had been running from truth for 30 years, finally stopping. I spoke about the radical inversion of values these words represented, how Jesus had blessed those the world considered cursed, how he had promised the kingdom to those who had nothing, how his ethics challenged every assumption about power and success and the good life. I spoke for 30 minutes, the longest I had ever spoken about any single text. I forgot the protective phrases, forgot the boundaries, forgot that Fahad was recording every word. I forgot everything except the truth that was pouring out of me after decades of containment. When I finally stopped, when the spell broke and I saw my students' faces clearly, I knew immediately that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. Some students looked moved, others uncomfortable. A few, including Fahad, looked troubled in a way that should have terrified me. I dismissed class early, my hands shaking as I erased the whiteboard, wiping away the words that would cost me everything. Students filed out in silence. Fahad paused at the door, his phone in his pocket now, his face unreadable. He looked at me for a long moment, his father's friend, his former professor, the man who had just revealed dangerous secrets in a classroom at the kingdom's most conservative Islamic university. Then he left without a word, and I knew, with a certainty that felt like ice in my stomach, that my life as I had known it was over. Everything you've built can disappear in 72 hours. Every reputation you've protected, every career you've constructed, every comfortable life you've maintained through careful silence. It can all end the moment you finally tell the truth. If you've ever wondered whether honesty is worth the cost, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, because what happened next will show you that some truths are worth losing everything to embrace. Fahad submitted the recording to the university administration on Sunday morning, less than 24 hours after my lecture. I didn't know this yet. I woke that morning thinking perhaps the strange moment in my classroom would be forgotten, dismissed as an academic eccentricity, absorbed into the routine of another semester. I attended Jummah prayer at the university mosque on Friday afternoon, 5 days after the lecture. The imam's sermon was about the dangers of intellectual pride, the ways that education could lead believers astray from simple faith, the importance of guarding against foreign ideas that corrupted pure Islamic teaching. I had heard similar sermons hundreds of times, but that afternoon I felt eyes on me during the sermon, colleagues who wouldn't meet my gaze, students who whispered when I passed. Something was happening, something I couldn't see but could feel, like pressure building before a storm. The call came Monday morning at 9:17 a.m. The dean's secretary, her voice formal, distant. Dr. al-Rashidi, the dean requests your presence in his office at 11:00 a.m. this morning. Please do not be late. No explanation, no pleasantries, just the summons that every academic fears, the call that means your career is under review, your colleagues have turned on you, your professional life is in danger. Dean Fahd al-Shamari was a man I had known for 15 years. We had served on committees together, published in the same journals, attended the same conferences. We were not friends exactly, but we were respectful colleagues who had always treated each other with professional courtesy. But when I entered his office that Monday morning, the courtesy was gone. He did not stand to greet me, did not offer the usual pleasantries about family and health. He simply gestured to the chair across from his desk and said, "Sit down, Hamza." On his computer screen was a paused video. I could see my own face frozen mid-sentence, my hand holding a marker, the whiteboard behind me filled with Arabic text that I knew without reading would be the Beatitudes. "I've watched this 17 times since it was submitted yesterday," the dean said, his voice tight with controlled anger. 17 times, trying to understand how a professor at this institution, a man with a PhD in Islamic philosophy, could stand before Muslim students and promote Christian teaching as if it were divine revelation. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain about comparative ethics, academic freedom, the importance of exposing students to diverse perspectives. But the words died in my throat. Because he was right. I hadn't presented the Beatitudes as historical artifacts or interesting philosophical ideas. I had presented them as truth, as words that mattered, as wisdom that could transform lives. I had presented them the way a believer presents sacred text, because somewhere in my 30 years of running, I had become a believer. The committee will review the recording tomorrow, the dean continued. You are suspended from teaching effective immediately, pending the outcome of the investigation. You will not enter any classroom, meet with any student, or represent this university in any capacity until further notice. He slid a paper across his desk. Sign this acknowledgement of suspension. I signed with a hand that had stopped shaking. The terror I expected to feel never came. Instead, there was only that same strange relief I had felt in the classroom, the relief of a man whose mask had finally been torn away, whose double life was ending whether he was ready or not. Hamza, the dean said quietly as I stood to leave, his voice losing some of its official edge. What happened to you? We studied together. We taught together. You were one of our most respected scholars. How did you fall so far? I looked at him for a long moment. Fahd al-Shamari, a good man by conventional measures, devout, intelligent, successful, a man who had never questioned the foundations of his faith because those foundations had never failed to support him. I didn't fall, I told him. I finally stopped climbing. The investigation concluded Wednesday afternoon. I was terminated Thursday morning. 26 years of service ended with a single email informing me that my employment was permanently concluded due to conduct inconsistent with university values. I had exactly 3 hours to clean out my office and leave campus, and waiting for me when I got home would be consequences I couldn't yet imagine, and a wife who had been carrying the same secrets I had. Salma knew before I told her. In Saudi society, news of professional disgrace travels faster than news of professional success. Her sister had called that morning. A friend from the women's section of the mosque had called an hour later. By the time I arrived home at 3 p.m. carrying a box of personal items from my office, she had already heard 3 different versions of what I had done. I found her sitting in our living room, hands folded in her lap, face unreadable. The afternoon light filtered through the mashrabia screens, creating patterns on the floor that shifted as I moved. Tell me, she said simply. So I told her. Not just about the lecture and the recording and the termination, but about everything. The 30 years of questions, the secret reading in Cairo, the New Testament I had been studying for 3 years, the truth I could no longer deny. I told her that I believed Jesus was more than a prophet, that his words were more than ethical teachings, that he was the Son of God who had died for humanity's sins and risen from the dead. I told her everything I had been hiding from everyone, including her, especially her. She listened in absolute silence. When I finished, when I had laid bare every secret I had carried, she was quiet for so long I thought she might simply stand and leave. Gather the children and go to her father's house and begin divorce proceedings that would leave me alone with my dangerous new faith. Then she asked a question in a voice barely above a whisper. Do you believe he can forgive anything, no matter what someone has done? I thought she was asking about me, about whether Jesus could forgive a man who had lived a double life for 30 years, who had lied through careful silence, who had loved his career more than truth. Yes, I told her. That's what grace means. Unmerited favor. Forgiveness we could never earn. Even someone who has been reading the Injil in secret for 4 years, she asked. The world stopped. Salma stood and walked to our bedroom, returned carrying a small book I had never seen before, an Arabic New Testament worn from use, pages marked and creased, clearly read hundreds of times. She told me about Hannah, a woman I vaguely remembered from years ago, a former student of mine from 2009, a bright woman who had asked unusual questions about Christian philosophy. Hannah had married a Saudi man named Rashid and had publicly converted to Islam. But privately, Salma told me, Hannah had maintained her Christian faith through 15 years of marriage, hiding her New Testament, praying in secret, living the same double life I had been living. 2 years ago, Hannah had sensed something in Salma during their conversations, a hunger, a searching, questions that went deeper than conventional religious discussion. She had taken an enormous risk sharing her testimony and giving Salma this New Testament. Salma had been terrified to accept it, more terrified to refuse it. She had hidden the book in different places around our home for 4 years, in closets, beneath clothes, inside other books. She had read it only when certain she was alone. She had been carrying the same questions I had been carrying, drawn to the same Jesus who had been drawing me, living the same exhausting double life. "I was afraid to tell you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face now. "I thought you were a faithful Muslim who would be horrified by my doubts. I thought I was the only one who was broken this way. I thought I was alone." We wept together then. Husband and wife who had shared a bed for 22 years, raised children together, eaten thousands of meals together, all while both of us hid the same secret from each other. The coincidence seemed impossible, too perfect, unless someone had been orchestrating events, drawing two souls toward himself simultaneously, preparing both of us for this moment when our carefully constructed lives would collapse and we would finally stop running from the truth we had both been seeking. We knelt together on the floor of our living room that afternoon, not in the ritual posture of Islamic prayer, but in the posture of broken people finally surrendering to grace we could not earn and did not deserve. And for the first time in our lives, we prayed to Jesus, not as a prophet, but as Lord. Sometimes the person sleeping next to you is carrying the same secrets you are. Sometimes the one you think would never understand is asking the same questions you are afraid to ask. If this testimony is speaking to something in you, if you've ever hidden your real questions from the people closest to you, subscribe to this channel. Because what happened next, the attack that nearly killed me, would reveal why we had to be brought to the end of ourselves before we could truly begin. 3 weeks after my termination, on October 5th at 8:47 p.m., I was stabbed 42 times in the parking lot beneath my apartment building in the Al Malka district. The attack lasted approximately 4 minutes. I would spend the next 2 weeks in the ICU at King Fahd Medical City, my life suspended between this world and whatever comes next. I had been to the small grocery store 3 blocks from our apartment, a routine errand, buying milk and bread and fruit for breakfast. The evening was cool for October, pleasant, the kind of night that makes you grateful to be alive. I noticed the 3 young men when I was 50 meters from my building. They were standing near the entrance to the underground parking, talking quietly, their postures tense in a way that should have warned me. I recognized one of them as I got closer. Ahmad, a former student from my ethics course 2 years ago, a quiet young man, devout, the kind who prayed all 5 prayers and never missed Friday mosque. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. Our eyes met, and I watched his face transform from uncertainty to resolve. They moved quickly, surrounding me before I could react. Ahmed. 2 others I didn't recognize. The youngest one was crying even as he pulled a knife from beneath his thobe. "Dr. Al-Rashidi," Ahmed said, his voice shaking, "you were our teacher. You were supposed to guide us to truth. Instead, you led us toward kufr, toward Christian lies, toward..." His voice broke. The knife in his hand trembled. "We have to do this," he said, and he was crying now too. "For the honor of Islam, for the students you corrupted, for..." The first knife entered my side before he finished speaking. Pain is strange. The first wound didn't hurt as much as I expected. Just a sharp pressure, a burning, a wetness spreading across my shirt. I dropped the grocery bag. Oranges rolled across the concrete. The second wound was in my shoulder, the third in my abdomen, the fourth. I stopped counting. The world narrowed to bodies pressing close, to the smell of my own blood, to the wet sounds of knives entering flesh, to the strange detachment that happens when the mind recognizes it cannot process what is happening. I fell to my knees around wound 20, to my side around wound 30. By wound 40, I was barely conscious. The youngest attacker, the one who had been crying, was still crying as he stabbed me. "Forgive me, doctor," he whispered between each thrust. "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me." Ahmad stood apart from the others, his phone raised, recording. Just as he had recorded my lecture, capturing evidence, documenting righteousness as he understood it. I could hear sirens in the distance. Someone had called police. The attackers ran, disappearing into the maze of streets around the Al Malka district, leaving me in a pool of blood that looked black in the parking lot's fluorescent lights. I lay there for 17 minutes before the ambulance arrived, long enough to count my breaths. Long enough to wonder if each one would be my last, long enough to realize I was probably dying, and in those 17 minutes something happened that I cannot fully explain. The pain began to fade, not because I was losing consciousness, but because something else was filling the space where pain had been, a presence, a light that had no visible source, a peace that made no sense given my circumstances. I thought at first I was hallucinating from blood loss, but this was different from delirium. This was more real than the concrete beneath me, more solid than the blood soaking through my clothes. I heard a voice, not audible exactly, but more real than audible, more internal than external, more certain than anything I had ever heard with physical ears. "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with little. I will make you faithful with much, but not yet. Your work is not finished." The words from Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, words I had read 1,000 times, but spoken now with an authority that could only come from one source. I tried to respond, to ask why I was being spared, to protest that I hadn't been faithful, that I had run for 30 years, that I deserved this ending in a parking lot with 42 wounds. But the presence was already fading as the ambulance arrived, as paramedics surrounded me, as someone pressed gauze against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. And the last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was that voice again, quieter now, but absolutely certain. "I have more for you to write." I woke in the ICU at King Fahd Medical City 3 days after the attack, my body wrapped in bandages, tubes running from my arms, machines beeping their steady rhythms around me. Salma sat beside my bed, her eyes red from sleepless nights, her hand gripping mine like she could hold me to life through touch alone. The doctors told me later that I should have died. 42 stab wounds, including 3 that had penetrated vital organs. I had lost more than half my blood volume. My heart had stopped twice in the ambulance, but I didn't die. By medical measurements, my survival was improbable. By any other measurement, it was impossible. "Allah preserved you," my father said when he visited on the 4th day, his voice thick with emotion. "You must have important work left to do." He didn't know how right he was, or how wrong he was about which God had preserved me. The police investigation was perfunctory. The attackers had fled. No witnesses had come forward. The security cameras in the parking lot had mysteriously malfunctioned that evening. Everyone knew who was responsible, everyone knew why, and everyone, from the police officers taking my statement to the hospital administrators overseeing my care, understood that this was the price of corrupting Muslim students with Christian teaching. No one said it explicitly, no one needed to. I would be in the hospital for 2 weeks, physical therapy for 6 months after that, scars I would carry for the rest of my life. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the question that tormented me during those long days in the ICU. What did I do with a second chance I didn't deserve? Omar visited on the 6th day, my 19-year-old son studying computer engineering at King Fahd University. He sat beside my bed in silence for a long time, his face troubled in a way I had never seen before. Finally, he said, "Mother told me about everything." I waited, expecting anger, rejection, the horror of a devout Muslim son discovering his father had become a Christian. Instead, he pulled out his phone, opened a browser history he had hidden for months, YouTube videos from Christian apologists, Bible study podcasts, testimonies from former Muslims who had converted to Christianity. "I've been watching these for 8 months," he whispered, glancing toward the door to make sure no nurses were near. "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you would be ashamed. I thought I was the only one in our family who was broken this way. 3 souls in one family, all drawn to the same truth, all hiding from each other while seeking the same Savior. The coincidence was impossible, unless it wasn't coincidence at all." Layla, our 16-year-old daughter, was the only one who hadn't been touched yet, but Salma and I agreed we would wait. Let her finish secondary school, give her time to find her own path without the pressure of her family's conversion. We would protect her as long as we could from the cost we knew she would eventually have to pay. We prayed together in that hospital room, the 3 of us, father, mother, son, praying to Jesus in whispers while hospital staff passed in the hallway outside, asking him to heal my body, to protect our family, to show us what came next. And he answered. Not with words this time, but with peace that made no sense in our circumstances, peace that could only come from one source. It has been 2 months since the attack, 8 weeks since I nearly died in a parking lot beneath my apartment, 60 days since everything I built over 52 years was stripped away, and I have never been more alive. I no longer teach at the university. That career is permanently over, not just at Imam Muhammad ibn Saud, but at any institution in the kingdom. I am blacklisted, my name associated with corruption and deviance and dangerous ideas. I work now as a private tutor, helping wealthy families prepare their children for university entrance exams. The pay is a fraction of what I earned as a professor. The work is less intellectually stimulating. I teach in living rooms instead of lecture halls. But I am no longer a fraud, no longer a man divided against himself. No longer trapped in the exhausting performance of pretending to be something I'm not. I earn less money, I have less prestige. I will never publish another book or train another doctoral student or receive another academic honor, and I would not go back for anything. We worship now with a small community of secret believers who meet in homes throughout Riyadh. Never the same location twice, always cautious, always aware that discovery could mean imprisonment or worse. There are perhaps 25 of us. A businessman who came to faith through reading the Bible on his phone during business trips. A teacher who was given a New Testament by a Filipino colleague. A young woman who encountered Jesus in a dream she couldn't explain away. We gather in 2s and 3s, rotating through apartments, singing worship songs in whispers, praying with voices barely above breath. We study the Bible together, learning what it means to follow Jesus in a land where following Jesus is forbidden. We celebrate baptisms in bathtubs and kitchen sinks because we have no rivers or public fonts. We share communion using bread from the grocery store and juice from boxes because we have no formal church. And it is the most real worship I have ever experienced. My scars are healing, 42 wounds becoming 42 reminders of the grace that preserved me when I should have died. I trace them sometimes in the shower, remembering Ahmed's face as he stabbed me, remembering the crying boy who asked my forgiveness with each thrust of his knife. I forgive them, truly. Not because I'm noble, but because I've been forgiven for greater crimes. I lived a double life for 30 years. I taught wisdom while hiding the wisdom that could have saved souls. I protected my career while people around me starved for truth I had but wouldn't share. If Jesus could forgive that, I can forgive 3 young men who thought they were defending their faith. Salma and I pray for them by name, for Ahmed and the crying boy and the 3rd attacker whose face I never saw clearly. We pray that the same Jesus who found us will find them, that the truth they tried to kill will be the truth that sets them free. I think often about that voice in the parking lot. I have more for you to write. I didn't understand then. I was a terminated professor who would never publish academically again. What did I have left to write? But I understand now. This testimony is what I was meant to write, not for academic journals or scholarly presses, but for you, for anyone who has been running from truth they know will cost them everything, for anyone who has been living a double life, hiding what they truly believe from the people who would reject them if they knew, for anyone who hungers and thirsts for righteousness but fears the cost of being filled. The Beatitudes. I wrote on that whiteboard, the words that destroyed my career and nearly ended my life were not random. They were not academic illustrations or historical curiosities. They were an invitation from Jesus himself to me, to Salma, to Omar, to you. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. I hungered for 30 years, studied wisdom from every tradition, consumed philosophy from every culture, searched in texts and ideas and intellectual frameworks for something to satisfy the empty place inside me. And I was never filled until I stopped searching and started surrendering. Jesus said, "Whoever seeks to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." I tried to save my life for 30 years, career, reputation, professional success, the respect of colleagues, and the approval of society. I lost it all in 72 hours, and in losing it, I found life I never knew was possible. If this testimony has opened something in you, if you recognize your own hunger in my story, if you've been running from truth that keeps pursuing you, if you're ready to stop performing and start living, then I want to ask you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel so more testimonies like mine can reach others who are searching. Second, comment below with 1 word that describes what you're feeling right now, just 1 word, so we know you're out there, so other seekers know they're not alone. And third, if you're ready to stop running, if you're ready to let Jesus fill the hunger that nothing else has satisfied, pray with me right now. Tell him you're done hiding. Tell him you're done pretending. Tell him you want the truth, whatever it costs. He'll hear you. He heard me in a parking lot with 42 wounds. He'll hear you wherever you are, and he'll do for you what he did for me. He'll take your death and turn it into life. He'll take your ending and make it your beginning. Subscribe, comment, and stop running. The teacher whose words cost me everything is waiting to give you everything you've been searching for.